I'm Atika Schubert in Berlin, and this is CNN.
It's a record-breaking end to the week on Wall Street. Trading is over on this Friday, August 24th. Tonight's stock markets set some summertime records as Jay Powell promises the economy won't overheat. Donald Trump's money man gets immunity in the latest White House legal drama. And it might be the most expensive supercar in history. I'll ask the president of Bugatti about the new €5 million Devo. I'm Stephanie Tsai. This is Quest Means Business. Good evening. Tonight, this is good news. Those were the words of U.S. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, who says the U.S. economy is doing great and inflation is in check. In short, Powell says his policy of interest rate rises at the Fed is working, despite any criticism from President Donald Trump. His comments sent markets flirting with a return to their record-setting ways. Let's take a look at the way the three indices ended today. The Dow up 140 points, and you can see new records set by the S&P 500 as well as the NASDAQ. That brings our 2018 records here up. The NASDAQ setting 26 records this year, and the S&P now at 15. Earlier at the New York Stock Exchange, trader Tim Anderson told Quest Express that Jerome Powell's words are a breath of fresh air for investors.
I think that clearly his comments are reassuring for the market, and I also think there's this underlying tone of his delivery not being a PhD economist.
You think that's helping?
He's almost like a breath of fresh air. He's very understandable for a lot of people to listen to. You don't have to be a Fed wonk or a Fed watcher to understand what he's saying.
It was clearly an upbeat appearance from the Fed chairman at Jackson Hole. Mr. Powell dismissed fears that the U.S. economy is out of control, saying there is no sign of it overheating. He did not address the criticism he's received from President Trump over rate hikes. Instead, he insisted the central bank will stay on course for future rises. Powell also played down fears of rising inflation, saying the Fed will do whatever it takes to keep it in check. Paul LaMonica joins me now. Whatever it takes, that sounds actually like familiar verbiage. Let's start with the new records we saw, the S&P and the NASDAQ, again, beating records. How long will the party last, and what drove that sentiment today? Yeah, I think today, Stephanie, you already talked about Jerome Powell's speech, and I think that really did it. He showed the market once again that he's confident about the U.S. economy, but the Fed has to try and keep inflation in check as well. That's why there are going to be probably a couple of more rate hikes this year, maybe a few in 2019 as well. And the market is okay with that. So even though the president has been attacking the Fed and criticizing rate hikes, it's not something that Powell is going to change Fed policy just because President Trump has been, making noise about how rate hikes might be bad news, because the market clearly disagrees with the president there. Now, earlier this week, we did hear Jerome Powell sort of nod at the fact that trade tensions continue with Trump's aggressive trade policy stance, that could have future impacts on inflation as well as growth. And yet the markets really seem to be shrugging that part of the story off. And we did not hear a lot of mention about that again today. No, in the Fed minutes, you're right that the Fed did acknowledge some members that trade concerns are an issue. I think right now what we're still having is that while some companies have noted that tariffs and trade issues are starting to hurt earnings, a lot of companies said it's still just talk, that businesses are mentioning trade issues as a concern, but it's not hurting the overall profit picture or the economy just yet. And I think the same thing is happening with consumers, because, Stephanie, consumer spending has been great. Retailers have reported, for the most part, really strong results. We're talking about
brick-and-mortar retailers also, not just Amazon.
Yeah, and the Targets of the world saying this is among the best consumer environments they've ever seen. Again, I go back to the question of how long will this last and why it's important even for Powell to continue the gradual rate hikes in an environment where inflation doesn't seem to be really going up at this point.
Yeah, inflation isn't going up all that much just yet, but it's the type of thing that if you let it go unchecked, all of a sudden you have rampant inflation and rates would have to go a lot higher than what the Fed would probably like. I think they're happy, and the market clearly is as well, with just a couple of quarter-point hikes every few meetings. That's something that's manageable. With regards to how much longer this rally can last, if consumers keep spending, corporations keep spending, profits should still be pretty good. The dollar weakened today as well, which should help multinational companies going forward if that continues to go down. So I'm not going to say that this bull run goes on obviously forever. It has to peak at some point, but earnings are still justifying this rally, it appears.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you bring up basically the notion of preemption being important with the gradual rate hikes. Paula, Monica, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Later in the program, I'm going to be speaking to Alan Blinder, who is vice chairman of the Fed under Alan Greenspan. He'll be joining us from Jackson Hole in just a few minutes. Two top White House officials are quietly lobbying against Donald Trump's tariffs now that the trade war is threatening a company in their home state. Martin Savage has more from Winnsboro, South Carolina.
The tariffs have been incredible.
Even as they work for a president who has proclaimed tariffs are the greatest, CNN has learned from two members of the South Carolina congressional delegation, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney have been pushing for a tariff exemption for a company in their home state.
We're winning on trade.
President Trump says he wants to level the trade playing field by imposing tariffs on as much as $200 billion more imported Chinese products and parts. Corporate leaders have been telling Washington how much those tariffs will hurt business and the economy. But behind the scenes, Mulvaney and Ambassador Haley are advocating for a small South Carolina company named Element Electronics to get something every impacted company would love to have, an exemption for their Chinese supplier.
We have advocates for South Carolina and this Element plant to include these two individuals that are fighting for the unique case that we have that makes this policy impossible for us to implement in South Carolina.
South Carolina State Senator Mike Fanning welcomes Mulvaney and Haley's help for Element, which is in his district, claiming Element deserves the exemption because it's the only company in America assembling television sets, selling them to Walmart. Last month, Element shocked the tiny town of Winnsboro, population 3,800, announcing it was shutting down and laying off 126 employees, blaming Trump's proposed tariffs, which the company says will make its TVs too expensive. CNN has reached out to Element Electronics, but they have not responded to multiple requests.
Anytime jobs are lost, there's a trickle-down effect where people don't have money to spend, they can't spend it. And so it affects everyone.
Winnsboro and Fairfield County have had what one official calls the year from hell. In July 2017, the construction of 2 nuclear reactors was abandoned, resulting in the loss of close to 6,000 jobs. Next came the shuttering of a large textile mill that had provided jobs for more than a century. The county hospital is closing. And now Element, Winnsboro's largest remaining private employer, is poised to call it quits.
It rocked me to my core.
Mulvaney and Haley both have a connection to Element. In 2013, then Governor Haley lured Element Electronics to the state by offering more than $1 million of state money, as well as tax incentives. Later, she was boasting about the economic benefits of the company in a promotional video for Walmart.
$7.5 million invested, 500 jobs in Winnsboro.
Before he was Trump's budget director, Mick Mulvaney was Congressman Mulvaney, representing the district where Element set up shop. And you don't see the hypocrisy in his effort to do that for his state?
Absolutely not.
Fanning, a Democrat, says Mulvaney and Haley's advocacy is neither hypocritical nor political, pointing out in 2016 his district voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. He says the pair are helping because it's justified. But the president's tariff pain will be felt nationwide, and as corporations warn of cutbacks and layoffs, many communities can only wish They had two high-level administration members fighting for them. Officials with Element say that if they were to get an exemption, or if those proposed tariffs were to simply go away, they could be back in business in a matter of months, possibly even think about expanding, which would be a welcome dose of good news in this small, economically hard-hit town. Martin Savage, CNN, Winnsboro, South Carolina.
For more on the trade tension and Jerome Powell's speech, Alan Blinder is a former vice chair of the U.S. Fed, and he joins me from all the action in Jackson Hole. Professor Blinder, thank you so much for your time. I wanted to just get your interpretation on Fed Chairman Jerome Powell's speech.
I think it was very much a defense of the status quo, which I guess is the status quo path. The path is now that the Fed is now on, and he was giving every indication will continue to be on. I think if you want to place this in the, at the margin, was this hawkish or dovish? I think it was dovish, and whatever you believe about now, that which does not contradict what I just said about interest rates going up, because the dovishness is about the stopping point. How far do you push this? So if you had to choose between reading this as a little hawkish, though there was a little bit of that, and a little dovish, I think there was more of the latter.
There were, and this path that you're referring to is that there are two more planned rate hikes before the end of the year. Now, based on that rate of inflation and Powell's comments that the economy does not seem to be overheating, do you predict the Fed will stick with both of those hikes? Is that how you interpreted Powell's comments?
Yes, I think it's likely. The September one is baked in the cake, that's for sure. We're almost there. Things can happen between now and December. That's still a few months away. But I think if the economy keeps trundling along the path on which it's been trundling, a December rate hike of another 25 basis points is quite likely. That's where the Fed will start getting into serious decision-making. How much further, if any, do we want to go?
They want to avoid that inverted yield curve, I know, and the potential for recession. I want to kind of switch gears here, sir, because you've probably followed President Trump's tweets criticizing that path to gradually hike rates that his own appointed Fed chair, Jerome Powell, has set the Fed on. How vulnerable do you think this Fed is to political pressure, especially with the high-stakes midterm elections in the U.S. coming up in November?
It's a very good question. I think the answer is only modestly, because you ask yourself, what could Trump do to the Fed? He's already appointed Powell instead of some incapable crony of his own, which would not have been a surprise from President Trump. Powell is a good man. He believes in the independence of the Fed. He has said so if necessary. He will say so again. He's got complete 100% backing from inside the Fed on that subject. I think he has very substantial backing, though not 100%, from members of Congress in their oversight capacity. So what Trump can do is two things. He can make nasty tweets, as we've seen is his wont in many, many, many contexts, and sometimes they scare people and sometimes they don't. I don't think the Fed will scare that easily. Or he could use his remaining appointment powers. There are still vacancies on the Fed, in great contradistinction to what he's been doing up to now, to put terrible people on the Federal Reserve Board. That is not what he has chosen to do up to now. His appointments to the Fed, his nominees, have been good, and we hope it'll continue that way. But he does have the capability, if he gets mad, to send people that'll just make Jay Powell's life miserable.
Before I let you go, I want to get your comment on another issue I know you've been talking about, and that is the trade tensions that the Trump policies have begun. The Fed did refer in their minutes to these ongoing tensions and the potential for negative effects. From the Fed's point of view, what can they do to mitigate risks to inflation or potentially growth that Trump's aggressive trade policy might pose?
I think pretty much nothing. They're watching, like all of us are, with no ability to influence trade policy. Nor should they have, by the way. The Fed has a great independence, he was just talking about, but in a prescribed area, and that does not include trade policy. If it happens, well, I shouldn't say if it happens. It is happening, and the only question is how severe this trade shock is going to get. A trade shock is a supply shock to the central bank, so it's analogous to giving them the same dilemma that they have in the old days when oil prices would shoot up. That causes a bit more inflation. In this case, it's a bit more. In the oil shock case way back, it was a lot more. But in this case, a bit more. And it takes a bit of a bite out of growth. Neither one of those is good. And that leaves the Fed with the same dilemma it had back in the oil shock days. Do you expand the economy to make up for the lost growth, or do you try to push against demand to stand against the rise in inflation? That's the kind of choice the Fed will have with a big trade war.
All right. Alan Blinder, thank you so much for your perspective from Jackson Hole.
You're welcome. Bye.
Still ahead, the man who looked after the U.S. president's business has been granted immunity in the probe into hush money payments. And Mr. Trump says social media companies are censoring people. At the same time, America's tech CEOs are meeting to talk about security during the next election.